Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow crawl through my Penguin classics, what Hannah at Hannah's Books refers to as my March of the Penguins. And we are going through them book by book and author by author, uh, waddling from left to right, which once upon a time, not that long ago in this little book room, would have meant absolute chaos. We would be bouncing all over the literature of the East and West, all over the canon and not. But a while ago, I decided that I was spending too much time not pondering at the Penguin Wall, which I love to do, but searching at the Penguin Wall, wondering if I already have something in a Penguin Classic, and that was starting to get annoying. So one day I decided to just put everything on the floor, pull everything off the shelves and put them in piles on the floor and assemble at least a vague chronological order. And that's why we're concentrating here at the beginning of the March of the Penguins on the ancient world. We'll be doing this all year long, and I can't promise this kind of consistency throughout. But that's why at the beginning here we're dealing with the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, with the occasional digression elsewhere. And today we have been talking throughout this March of the Penguins of a couple of things. We've of course been discussing translations, the vagaries of translations, the philosophies of translations, some successful, some not. We have to do that because these things come to us through a prism. There are very few people that I've ever taught these books to or shared these books with who could ever read them in their own language. So we have to talk about translation for a lot of it, especially since it's a multifaceted question. It's not only that you can't read these things in the original, it's that the writers in the original languages were some of the finest crafters of that language imaginable, which makes translation necessary and also incredibly perilous. How are you going to capture all of that? Most of what brilliant authors in any language will do cannot be captured. That's what led one famous wag to say that that poetry is what gets lost in translation. And that is true of prose as well. As I've mentioned on this channel, I might not hold any water for instance, the ancient Roman orator Cicero, but I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that he did things that cannot be translated. Livy the same way, the Roman historian Livy. So that's one of the things that we've been dealing with. We've been talking over and over again about the vagaries of translation. But another thing that we've been dealing with is the pitiless ratio of survival. When we're talking about works from the ancient world, before the printing press, before widespread literacy, and over a vast amount of time, even with those things out of the picture, there's still a vast amount of time, a vast amount of chances for hand-copied manuscripts to go awry. And the author that we're talking about today is the living epitome of the pitiless ratio, and that is the Roman poet Catullus, who is this is once again a Roman fresco, although in this case not particularly objectionable. If you're going to do a Roman fresco, clean it up and make it look like that, fine, then I'm okay with it. But Catullus wrote his poems in a bewildering variety of meters and styles, probably at the heyday of Cicero and Julius Caesar. He writes about both men. He writes often about a femme fatale named Lesbia, who was almost certainly a famous Roman noblewoman named Clodia. So we can roughly place him in time. We know that he was popular. We know that he was well known. We know that his poems were created into jingles, that they were sung, that they were admired. He had the gift of getting the barbers and the butchers at the Suburra to know his verses and love them, the same as the poetasters up on the Palatine. He had that gift. Not many poets do, even today. I would argue almost none of them do today. When's the last time a general reader that you know knew any poet by name who's alive? It's a rare talent, and it always has been. One of the ways that Catullus capitalized on that, I think he could have done it with anything. You can see in his poems such a wide variety of subject matter and they all have that effect, that I think he could have made that happen with any kind of subject matter, but he helped things along by writing about love and lust. There's almost nothing in the way of schmaltz or sentiment when he writes about lust, it's almost always physical. And it's not just physical lust, it's the way physical lust can drive a young person insane. Make them stop eating, make them stop thinking about anything else, make them walk into walls. There are almost no, in all this time with all these poets, there's almost nobody who captures that better than this poet does. Even after all this time, and even in an English language translation of incredibly complex Latin, it still comes through. It still comes through. The poems that he writes is about Lesbia, yes, but there's also a long sequence of poems in here about Juventius, who's a man. The lust, the sexual lust in these poems is not purely heterosexual at all. Not at all. And it's equally effective both ways. This is the Penguin Classic translation by Peter Wigham, and as he says in his introduction, you can't tell the difference in terms of approach. There's no sense of shame or pathology involved when the focus shifts to lusting after a man as opposed to lusting after a woman, and that is refreshing. there is a refreshing immediacy in the way that Catullus writes about love, about lust. He writes about lots of other things too, and he varies up his style, and you can tell that from Wigham's poetry. Look here, I'm gonna try and show you. See that? Oh, there's one that's much thinner on the page. There's some that are very short. There's some that are very long. There's some that are see that? It's just a column, but this is much wider, and that reflects all of the choices that Catullus made, including a somewhat rare, somewhat odd choice for a Roman poet of hendecasyllables, which is virtually impossible to do in English, but it was no basket of roses in Latin either, and Catullus makes it seem like as easy as breathing. And it creates beautiful, beautiful effects with it. Effects, most of which could not be done in English, or you would need that rarest of rare things. You would need, in order to bring Catullus completely over to English, you would need an English language poet who is as talented as Catullus. And also a Latinist. that is extremely rare. That almost never happens in the history of translation. That almost never happens. You will often get translators, including in the Penguin Classic line, who will be billed as poets, but they are minor poets. They are minor poets. They are not. Imagine, what's an example? The bucolic poetry of Virgil, the poetry of the countryside and stone walls and beehives and whatnot. Imagine that poetry of Virgil translated by Robert Frost, and you get some sense of the kind of alignment that you need. It almost never happens. I would argue that one famous example that I'm very glad caught on, I think if you had that happen, it would catch on everywhere. One famous example in the modern time, I think, would be Seamus Heaney translating Beowulf, where you get a brilliant poet who brings all his brilliance to bear in conveying the brilliance of an original poem. I would argue, of course, it's doomed. Nobody's going to believe it. Nobody argues in this defense anymore. But I would argue that Longfellow's Dante is the same way. But that's a rant for another time. It's my contention that has never been done with Catullus. But it doesn't matter, because his poems are so heartfelt and so blazing. They're on fire to such a degree that I have read ham-handed Cantabrigian dons translate this stuff. Walrus-whiskered things who've never known a moment of passionate physical love in their entire lives. And I've known them. I've seen translations of theirs where it works, where it comes through. That's how powerful Catullus is. They were known everywhere, these poems. He mocked Julius Caesar. He mocked the rich and powerful. He also praised them, and they loved him for it. And that's where the pitiless ratio comes in. Because all of that is gone. Completely gone. All of it. Catullus comes to us in one manuscript. One. Found in what was probably his native Verona in the 13th century. It floated around in semi-scholarly circles just about long enough to get copied out. We don't know the veracity of the copies. We don't know how good they are. They might be terrible. And the reason we don't know that is because the original one and only Catullus manuscript floated around for a little while and disappeared again. So the pitiless ratio doesn't get any more pitiless than this. If the ratio were any worse for Catullus, we wouldn't have him at all. We would have records, rumors of a poet named Catullus, but we wouldn't have anything. Catullus had an almost exact contemporary who wrote very similar poetry, for whom that is true. We don't have any of his poems. We just have his name and something of his influence. I want you to think about that for a minute. Don't think about it enough to ruin your day, but think about that for a minute. A manuscript, one manuscript found in the 13th century. The folklore has always been that it was propping up a wine barrel and had been wine stained. That was 1,300 years after Catullus wrote. 1,300 years of manuscripts living and dying, being eaten by mice, being swamped by water, being rotted by snow or mold or moths. 1,300 years from when Catullus actually wrote his poems. So we have no idea at all. That original, that one and only manuscript, we have no idea how accurate it was. None whatsoever. What if it was made by a moron? What if it was made by a schoolmarm who had a fairly good, how good it could be after 1,000 years? I don't have any idea. I can guess, and I think you can too. But let's say, to strain probability's sake, let's say that that original manuscript came to a copyist in Verona in relatively good shape, and maybe 3 times as long. And let's say the copyist not only thought, oh, I only have a week to do this for a patron who wants some ancient poems. I don't know who this person is, but this seems up my patron's alley, but I only have a week, and I can't copy all of this in a week, so I'm just going to pick and choose some of the good ones. And I'm not really sure that I like this hendecasyllable business. I'm not sure that I understand some of these metrical choices, so I'm going to clean it up as I go along. How do we know that the copyist who made that one manuscript didn't make those decisions? Or that the copyist, 3 copyists and 10 generations before that person didn't make those decisions, and the one manuscript that we get Catullus from was just recopied 1,000 times over from that original bad decision 300 years before? We don't. We don't have any idea. We don't know. And that manuscript disappeared. So we don't know how faithfully the manuscripts that copied it did their job. So when Peter Wigham engages in a huge scholarly bit of conjecture in his introduction to this Penguin Classic, which is very good, you are well advised to discount all of it. That seems strange to say since it's a wonderful piece of scholarship, but none of it is known. None of it. And not just the details of Catullus's life. We go for those details. We go to his poems, but those could easily be conventions of Roman poetry. He could easily be saying, well, I'm poor, because it was fashionable for poets to say that they were poor so that you would buy their manuscript. Or maybe it was a spoken thing, and they wanted you to tip them. There are poems in here. He writes a very moving poem about his dead brother. That's probably true. There's a poem about a trip by yacht. That's probably true. But we don't know how well it's embellished. One way or another, even if you leave out all of the biographical details, which are fit grounds for conjecture. People have been conjecturing about Catullus and Lesbia for 2,000 years. But if you leave all that out, if you say, well, it's coming mostly from the poems, so you can. It's a fun parlor game, but you can't make anything of it. And just concentrate on, for instance, the sequence of the poems. That's guesswork as well. There are all sorts of scholarly games you can play with internal evidence of which poems look like they're leaning to or adumbrating or echoing other poems in the few that we have from Catullus, but it's guesswork. We will never know unless we get a much earlier manuscript. Unless Catullus comes to light, we will never know. So this is a distant, dim and garbled echo of what certainly was a great Roman poet. Which I think makes it all the more amazing that these are so enjoyable. Even in English language translations, Wigham's is just fine, but any Catullus, as I mentioned, any Catullus that you find in your library will convey to you why people have loved this poet for so long, why they have bothered to keep him, hold on to him, and whatnot. And you'll notice a lot of variation, as you would couldn't help but notice because of the variation that I mentioned that Catullus practiced himself. Like Horace, only to a greater degree, he practiced all sorts of metrical inventions, restlessly, trying his talent in each one of them, seeing what they could do if he brought his brilliance to bear on them. And translators over the last 500 years have had a wide open field for what to do about that. Do I try to reproduce hendecasyllables? Do I try to do that? Do I try iambs or trimeters or whatever? Do I try that in English and see what result I can do? It's a wonderful exercise. Sometimes you can make readable jog trot out of it. Or do I regularize them all and instead concentrate on conveying the sense, the atmosphere, the passion, and figure that an English language only reader is not going to care. They're never going to read the originals, so they're not going to care. And maybe some of the more cynical translators would say, we don't know that we're reading the originals. We don't know we're reading anything close. So it really doesn't matter. You have, in other words, a huge amount of variation when it comes to translating Catullus, as you've seen over the last few centuries. And thankfully, Penguin acknowledged that with one other volume in the series that we've been seeing on this channel, which is Catullus in English. This series that Penguin did isn't a translation history. Instead, it pops you in with dozens and dozens of different translators of very varying talent levels. Some of them famous, some of them you've never heard of before. Some of them classicist dons, some of them laymen and laywomen. And with Catullus, more than with a lot of other poets, it means a lot. It means a lot. It helps a lot to do that. Because Catullus's provenance is so incredibly perilous. It's so incredibly thin. And because his variety is so great. A book like this really helps a lot. I wish that Penguin still made these, and I wish they'd made these for a lot of other authors. But if they're going, I think they only made 6 or 7 of these things. If they're going to do that, I'm glad they stuck to some authors who really need it. Catullus really needs it. There are elements in this poet, great many elements, that will be just the same as I mentioned with Horace, where you will feel like you know this person. Once you get to know his poems really well, you'll feel like you know him. And no matter what English language version you use, there will be turns of thought, however the translator phrases them, that will stick with you. They will start to become your turns of thought. You will use them in times of great physical desire, or in times of grief, or in times of hating the politician who's in charge of your world. You will start to think in Catullan terms, and that will be wonderful. Same thing with Horace. Horace has the same effect. I guess great poets always do, although I tend to do it mostly with the poets of ancient Rome. And this is one of my favorites. So your Penguin Classic today is a wholehearted recommendation. I wish that time had been gentler to Catullus. I can't think of a Roman poet who would have cared less, but I wish time had been gentler to him. But I'm glad we have something. We don't have much, but I'm glad we have something. So if you want to give it a try, if you want to give Catullus a try, I say go for it. Try the Peter Wiggum translation. It's just fine. It shows a lot of intelligence, a lot of quick-footedness. Or find some other translation. Or if you can, if your library has it, find Catullus in English and find out all the variation that can be done. But there's your Daily Penguin for today, a giant, even though we have one Weinstein manuscript to thank for it, and that is the poems of Catullus. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but we'll be back tomorrow, so you can waddle back then. Thank you, BookTube.